What if one of the smartest buildings in human history wasn't made of stone, wood, or brick, but from living earth? For centuries, people believed Viking turf houses were nothing more than primitive shelters built by settlers who had run out of timber. But modern archaeology tells a very different story. These homes weren't signs of poverty. They were extraordinary machines for survival, designed to trap heat, resist violent storms, and keep entire families alive through some of the harshest winters on Earth. Even more surprising, many of the ideas behind them resemble principles used in sustainable architecture today. So how did Viking settlers create homes that could survive for centuries using little more than grass, soil, and a handful of driftwood? The answer begins on an island that changed everything they thought they knew. When Norse settlers first arrived in Iceland around AD 870, they believed they were beginning a new chapter. Behind them lay the familiar fjords and forests of Norway. Ahead stretched an island few Europeans had ever called home, a place filled with promise, but also uncertainty. What they discovered was unlike anything they had prepared for. Iceland was beautiful, but it was unforgiving. Fierce North Atlantic storms swept across the open landscape with almost nothing to slow them down. Winters were long, dark, and bitterly cold. Volcanoes regularly reshaped the land, covering fields with ash and reminding every settler that the island itself was alive. Then came the realization that changed everything. The forests they had depended on for generations were largely missing. In Norway, timber had been the foundation of Viking life. It built their famous longships. It supported their great halls. It framed their homes, their workshops, and their temples. Wood wasn't simply a building material. It was the backbone of their civilization. But Iceland offered very little of it. Every usable tree became valuable. Every wooden beam had to last for decades. Broken timbers were repaired instead of replaced. Old buildings were carefully dismantled so their wood could be used again. Even driftwood that had floated thousands of miles across the Arctic Ocean from the rivers of Siberia or the forests of North America was collected like treasure whenever it washed onto Iceland's shores. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of wood represented survival. The settlers quickly understood a difficult truth. They could not recreate Norway on this new island. The building traditions that had served their ancestors for centuries no longer fit the world around them. They had two choices: fight the landscape or learn from it. The Vikings chose the second path. Instead of forcing the land to match their traditions, they began studying the island itself, its winds, its soil, its seasons, and the materials it freely offered. What they didn't realize was that the solution to their greatest challenge had been beneath their feet from the very beginning, waiting patiently for someone to see it, not as ordinary ground, but as one of nature's most extraordinary building materials. What looked like ordinary ground was, in reality, one of the most remarkable building materials nature had ever created. To the early Viking settlers, it wasn't immediately obvious. Beneath every step lay a thick layer of Icelandic turf, a living blend of tightly woven grass roots, moss, volcanic soil, moisture, and centuries of decaying organic matter. Formed slowly by the island's cold climate, this wasn't loose dirt that crumbled in your hands. It was dense, resilient, and surprisingly strong. The more the settlers observed it, the more they realized the land itself was offering an answer to their greatest problem. When carefully cut with long iron spades, large sections of turf held together almost like giant bricks. The tangled network of roots acted as a natural reinforcement, while countless tiny pockets of trapped air created an insulating barrier against the cold. What seemed soft on the surface concealed an extraordinary internal structure, one that modern engineers would recognize as a naturally occurring composite material. Layer by layer, the Vikings began transforming the living earth into walls. Those thick walls did far more than keep the wind outside. They slowed the escape of heat, softened the impact of relentless Atlantic storms, and created an indoor climate that remained remarkably stable even as temperatures plunged below freezing. Instead of constantly battling the weather, these homes quietly worked with it. Modern archaeological experiments have confirmed just how effective this system was. Full-scale reconstructions and thermal studies show that well-built turf houses retained heat far better than many people would imagine, allowing families to survive long winters while burning far less fuel than conventional wooden buildings of the same period. But discovering turf was only half the solution. A wall several feet thick was also incredibly heavy. After heavy rain or melting snow, the weight increased even more. Without proper support, those massive walls would gradually shift, settle, and eventually collapse under their own weight. The roof above added thousands of additional pounds, placing enormous pressure on every part of the structure. The Vikings understood that strong materials alone could never create a lasting home. They needed engineering, and the elegant solution they developed was so effective that more than 1,000 years later, archaeologists can still trace the outlines of these remarkable buildings across the Icelandic landscape, because hidden beneath every surviving turf house was an unseen foundation, the quiet masterpiece that made everything else possible. The Vikings never tried to defeat Iceland's unforgiving climate. They understood something far more powerful. The safest way to survive nature was to work with it, not against it. Back in Norway, Viking homes stood proudly above the landscape, supported by heavy timber frames and surrounded by forests that helped shield them from the wind. But Iceland offered no such protection. Across its open plains, powerful North Atlantic winds swept across the island with incredible force, carrying freezing rain, snow, and volcanic ash. A tall wooden house became an easy target for every passing storm. So the settlers changed their thinking. Instead of building higher, they built lower. Many Viking homes were constructed partially below ground level, allowing the surrounding earth to become part of the building itself. From a distance, these homes blended almost seamlessly into the landscape, appearing more like gentle grassy mounds than man-made structures. This wasn't an architectural style. It was survival engineering. By sinking the house into the earth, builders dramatically reduced the amount of wall exposed to the wind. The surrounding soil acted as a natural insulating blanket, helping the interior stay warmer through Iceland's brutal winters, while remaining cool during the brief northern summer. Just as importantly, the earth anchored the structure against storms that could destroy more exposed buildings. In many ways, the landscape became another wall of the house. Long before modern engineers spoke of passive heating or earth-sheltered architecture, Viking builders had already discovered one of its most effective principles through observation and experience alone. But every solution created a new challenge. A house surrounded by earth also meant constant exposure to moisture. Rainwater, melting snow, and damp soil threatened to weaken the heavy turf walls from below. Left unchecked, the entire structure could slowly lose its strength. The Vikings needed a way to keep the earth close, without allowing the water to follow. Their answer was simple, ingenious, and became the hidden foundation that allowed these remarkable homes to endure for centuries. Hidden beneath every Viking turf wall lay the part of the house that few people ever saw. But without it, nothing above could survive. A carefully engineered stone foundation. Rather than placing heavy turf directly onto damp ground, Viking builders first laid tightly packed stones across the base of the structure. It was a remarkably simple solution, yet one that solved several problems at once. The stone layer separated the walls from moisture rising through the soil, while creating natural drainage channels for rainwater and melting snow. The result was extraordinary. The turf remained drier, the walls stayed stronger, the entire house became more stable year after year. Modern excavations across Iceland continue to reveal these hidden foundations. In many archaeological sites, the turf walls have long since disappeared, reclaimed by time and nature. Yet the stone base still lies exactly where Viking builders placed it more than 1,000 years ago, quietly preserving the original outline of homes that once sheltered entire families. These foundations tell an important story. Viking turf houses were never meant to be temporary shelters. They were carefully planned structures built to withstand generations of harsh weather and constant change. But even the strongest walls and the smartest foundations could not solve one final challenge. The roof had to survive relentless wind, heavy rain, deep snow, and freezing winters year after year. To solve that problem, the Vikings created something truly remarkable. A roof that didn't simply cover the house. It became part of the living landscape itself. The most remarkable part of a Viking turf house wasn't the thick walls that protected it from the cold. It was the roof. To modern eyes, it looked almost ordinary. A gentle slope covered with grass, blending seamlessly into the Icelandic countryside. But beneath that living surface was an ingenious piece of engineering, carefully designed to withstand one of the harshest climates on Earth. The process began with a framework of wooden rafters. Timber was incredibly scarce in Iceland, so every beam mattered. Builders relied on valuable driftwood carried across the North Atlantic by powerful ocean currents, along with the few native trees the island could provide. Every piece of wood was carefully fitted into place, creating a strong but lightweight skeleton. Over those rafters, they laid overlapping sheets of birch bark. Naturally rich in waterproof oils, birch bark formed an effective barrier against rain and melting snow, protecting the timber beneath from constant moisture. Only then did the builders add the final layer, thick slabs of living turf, carefully arranged until the roof became a dense blanket of earth and grass. But the roof didn't remain frozen in time. Nature continued building it. Each spring, fresh grass pushed through the surface. Moss slowly spread across the slopes. Roots reached deeper into the layers below, weaving the turf together until the roof became stronger with every passing season. Instead of slowly wearing away, it evolved into a living part of the landscape. From a distance, many Viking farms almost disappeared into the rolling hills. Only a weathered wooden doorway, or a thin ribbon of smoke rising into the sky, revealed that families lived beneath the green earth. This wasn't camouflage. It was survival by design. The living roof trapped precious heat inside the home, absorbed heavy rainfall, softened the force of relentless Atlantic winds, and added enough weight to keep the structure firmly anchored during violent winter storms. The house no longer stood apart from the landscape. It became part of it. Yet even the finest roof and the thickest walls could only preserve warmth. They could not create it. For that, every Viking family depended on the same thing: a single fire burning at the heart of the home. At the heart of every Viking turf house burned a single fire. It was far more than a source of warmth. It was the center of family life, the place where every day began and every night came to an end. The hearth cooked meals, dried soaked clothing, warmed frozen hands, provided light during Iceland's endless winter darkness, and above all, kept entire households alive when the world outside became almost impossible to endure. Everything revolved around its glow. Wooden benches lined the walls, serving as seats by day and beds by night. Parents, children, grandparents, hired workers, and even travelers seeking refuge from a storm often slept together in the same hall, gathering as close to the fire as space allowed. Here, stories were shared, tools were repaired, wool was spun into clothing, meals were prepared, and children fell asleep to the familiar sound of crackling embers. The hearth wasn't simply part of the house, it was its beating heart. Yet the very design that made these homes so warm also created a dangerous trade-off. The thick turf walls and living roof trapped precious heat with remarkable efficiency, but they trapped smoke as well. During fierce winter storms, opening the roof vent too far could invite freezing winds or blowing snow into the house, cooling the interior in minutes. To protect the fire, many families kept the opening as small as possible, allowing a thin layer of smoke to linger beneath the rafters day after day. Modern archaeological excavations reveal the evidence. Heavy soot still coats the surviving timbers of Viking turf houses, showing that smoke was an unavoidable part of daily life. Researchers believe that years of breathing this smoky air may have contributed to chronic respiratory problems for many early Icelandic settlers. The hearth gave them warmth, it gave them food, it gave them life. But every breath carried a quiet reminder that survival in medieval Iceland always came at a cost. Outside, the freezing wind threatened death within minutes. Inside, the smoke demanded its own silent price. A Viking turf house was only one part of a much larger survival system. Around the main hall stood smaller buildings, each designed for a specific purpose. There were storerooms filled with dried fish, smoked lamb, grain, and preserved dairy. Workrooms where wool was spun into clothing. Small workshops where driftwood and iron were turned into tools. Animal shelters were often built nearby, allowing the warmth of sheep, goats, and cattle to help protect the entire homestead during winter. Many of these buildings were connected by enclosed passages or built only a few steps apart. That mattered. During a blizzard, visibility could disappear in seconds. Stepping outside for even a minute could become deadly. By keeping the buildings close together, families could move between them with far less exposure to the cold. Every structure had a purpose. Every room supported another. Together, they formed a self-sufficient system designed to survive months of isolation. Yet despite their complexity, these farms shared one surprising feature. From the outside, they all looked almost exactly the same, and that may have changed Icelandic society in ways few people expected. In Norway, powerful families displayed their wealth through enormous wooden halls, carved pillars, and impressive architecture. In Iceland, nature erased those differences. Whether someone was a wealthy chieftain or an ordinary farmer, most families lived beneath grass-covered roofs, built from the same turf and stone. From a distance, one home looked remarkably similar to the next. The weather didn't care about status. The wind ignored wealth. The cold treated everyone the same. Success was measured less by the size of a house than by the strength of a family, the health of its livestock, and the ability to prepare for the next winter. Some historians believe this harsh environment quietly reshaped Icelandic culture. Cooperation became just as valuable as power, and practical skill often mattered more than displays of wealth. The landscape demanded humility. Those who adapted survived. Those who refused often disappeared. But the greatest surprise about these homes wouldn't be discovered by the Vikings. It would be uncovered nearly 1,000 years later, when archaeologists and engineers began asking a remarkable question. What if these simple-looking houses were actually centuries ahead of their time? For generations, Viking turf houses were dismissed as primitive shelters built out of necessity. Modern research tells a different story. Archaeologists, architects, and environmental engineers now recognize these homes as remarkable examples of climate-adapted design. Thick turf walls slowed heat loss. Earth-covered roofs provided natural insulation, and partially buried foundations used the ground's stable temperature to reduce the effects of extreme weather. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was built without purpose. Every part of the house worked together as a single system. Recent experimental reconstructions have shown just how effective these buildings were. Properly built turf houses remained surprisingly warm, resisted powerful North Atlantic winds, and required far less fuel to heat than many early wooden homes. What once looked primitive now appears remarkably sophisticated. Some architects even study these houses today for ideas about sustainable building, energy efficiency, and working with nature instead of against it. Yet one question still remains. Why were the Vikings building homes so perfectly suited for colder centuries that had not fully arrived? By the late medieval period, the North Atlantic entered a colder and more unpredictable climate that would eventually become part of the period known as the Little Ice Age. The Viking settlers could never have known its name, but they understood something just as important: prepare for a future harsher than the present. Their turf houses were more than shelters. They were the result of careful observation of wind, soil, water, and seasons. Instead of forcing the landscape to change, they changed themselves. That may have been their greatest achievement. The Vikings are often remembered for their ships, their raids, and their battles. But their true genius was adaptation. They listened to the land. They learned from it. And because they did, many of their homes endured for centuries, leaving behind lessons that still inspire architects and historians today. The greatest civilizations are not always the ones that conquer the most territory. Sometimes, they are the ones that learn how to survive. And perhaps the most astonishing part of the story is how long that survival lasted. Long after the Viking Age ended, long after the great longships had rotted away on distant shores, the turf house tradition refused to disappear. It quietly continued, generation after generation, passed down like an inheritance too valuable to abandon. In the isolated valleys of Iceland, families were still building and repairing turf homes well into the 19th century, and in a few remote farms, even into the early 20th. Photographs from the 1890s show weathered farmers standing beside grass-covered walls that would have looked almost identical to the homes of their ancestors 1,000 years earlier. The tools had barely changed. The techniques had barely changed. The reasoning behind every wall, every stone, every layer of turf had barely changed. What worked in the 9th century still worked in the 19th, because the wind, the cold, and the earth had not changed either. That continuity gave Icelandic culture something rare in the modern world, an unbroken thread connecting daily life to the distant past. Skills that vanished across most of Europe centuries ago were still living memory in Iceland when the first automobiles arrived. Elderly farmers could remember cutting turf with their grandfathers, learning to read the soil the same way sailors read the sea. They knew which meadows produced the strongest slabs, how to stack them in the diagonal herringbone pattern known as klonbrunás, and how to time the harvest so the roots held together perfectly when lifted from the ground. This wasn't folklore. It was engineering knowledge, quietly preserved by people who had no other choice but to keep it alive. Today, only a handful of authentic turf houses still stand, carefully protected as national treasures. Sites like Glaumber in northern Iceland and Keldur in the south allow visitors to step through low wooden doorways and enter rooms that feel almost impossibly warm, even in the middle of a snowstorm. The moment the door closes behind them, the roaring wind outside becomes a distant whisper. The air grows still. The temperature stabilizes. Many visitors describe the same strange sensation, a feeling that the house is quietly breathing around them, alive in a way modern buildings rarely feel. It is a sensation the Vikings would have recognized instantly, because it was the very thing they designed their homes to create. Modern researchers have spent decades trying to understand exactly why these buildings work so well. Thermal imaging studies reveal that a properly built turf house maintains an interior temperature difference of 20 degrees or more compared to the outside air, without any active heating at all. Humidity sensors show that the thick earthen walls actually regulate moisture, absorbing dampness during wet seasons and slowly releasing it when the air grows drier. Acoustic tests confirm that the layered turf muffles outside noise so effectively that a violent storm can pass overhead almost silently. Every measurement reveals another quiet miracle hidden inside walls that once seemed nothing more than piled earth. Even more remarkably, the environmental cost of building these homes was almost nothing. There were no factories, no imported materials, no fossil fuels, no waste. When a turf house eventually reached the end of its life, it simply returned to the landscape it came from. The wood was salvaged for the next home. The stones were lifted and reused. The turf slowly melted back into the meadow, feeding the same soil that had once given it shape. In an age now searching desperately for sustainable ways to build, the Viking turf house stands as one of the most complete examples of circular architecture ever created. Nothing was taken that could not eventually be returned. Contemporary architects have begun to notice. In recent years, projects across Scandinavia, Scotland, and even North America have started experimenting with green roofs, earth-sheltered walls, and passive insulation strategies drawn directly from principles the Vikings mastered a millennium ago. Universities send students to Iceland to study surviving turf structures the way engineers once studied cathedrals. What was dismissed for generations as the crude housing of a rough frontier people has quietly become a source of inspiration for the buildings of the future. Yet the deepest lesson of the turf house has little to do with insulation or construction. It has to do with a way of seeing the world. The Vikings who settled Iceland arrived expecting to impose their traditions on a new land. Instead, the land taught them a harder and more valuable lesson. Survival did not come from strength alone. It came from attention. It came from patience. It came from the willingness to set aside inherited certainty and truly look at the world in front of them. The shape of a hillside, the direction of the wind, the way water moved through the soil after rain. Every choice they made was the result of watching, listening, and adjusting. Their homes were not monuments to human power. They were conversations with the earth. That conversation is written into every surviving foundation still traceable across the Icelandic countryside. Long green ridges mark walls that once sheltered families through winters of impossible darkness. Faint depressions show where hearths once burned. Piles of moss-covered stones outline rooms where children were born. Meals were shared, and stories were told across generations. Walk quietly across those meadows on a still evening, and it is not difficult to imagine the low murmur of voices rising from beneath the grass, the distant echo of a people who learned to disappear into the landscape, not because they were defeated by it, but because they had finally understood it. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Viking turf house. Not the walls, not the roofs, not even the extraordinary engineering hidden beneath every mound of earth. It is the reminder that the greatest form of intelligence is often the quietest. The ability to observe before acting, the humility to learn from a place before trying to change it, the wisdom to build something that belongs to the world instead of standing against it. 1,000 years later, the wind still moves across Iceland the same way it always has. The soil still holds together with the same tangled roots. And somewhere beneath the grass, the outlines of Viking homes still whisper a lesson we are only now beginning to hear again. If you enjoyed uncovering this forgotten chapter of Viking history, join us again on Old Mounds, where archaeology, science, and history come together to reveal how ancient people solved extraordinary problems and why their greatest discoveries still matter today.